Welcome back to WPI's Weird History Podcast. My name is Trey Marcantonio, and I'll be your host for this week's episode. Today we have two special guests here to talk about Rourke's Drift, Rosa and Andrew. This episode is being recorded on May 5th over Zoom. And to start us off, can you guys first of all talk about what's so special about Rourke's Drift?
Yeah, so kind of like the legendary Battle of Thermopylae, where several thousand Greek soldiers defended against a much larger Persian force while taking much fewer losses, the Battle of Rourke's Drift saw several hundred British soldiers defend against a much larger Zulu force of several thousand. But unlike Thermopylae, which ended up in a defeat by the Greeks, the Battle of Rourke's Drift was a decisive victory for the British, and one that became a patriotic moment both at home in the United Kingdom and abroad, and has also become immortalized in pop culture.
So, as a result of this battle, you see the immortalization. Were there any awards given to the soldiers who participated in this battle?
Yeah, so actually 11 of the soldiers were ended up receiving the Victoria Cross, which is the highest honor given out by the British royal family. And also, about a year later, a painting done by the painter Elizabeth Butler titled The Defense of Rourke's Drift kind of made headlines and became a national hit.
So with all this news circling around, I'm assuming that it had to have some effect on British morale. Do you mind explaining what that effect was?
Yeah, so for some context, the Battle of Rourke's Drift came immediately after another battle called the Battle of Isandlwana. Kind of like the Battle of Rourke's Drift, you had a really large Zulu force fighting against a much smaller British force. But in the case of Isandlwana, the result was different. Out of the 1,800 or so soldiers that fought, the British soldiers that fought in the battle, about 1,300 of them were killed, and it was a huge defeat for the British. And so once news of that battle reached the United Kingdom, there was huge outrage, both at the government and also the military, and it kind of really shattered their perceptions of themselves. I mean, at that moment, the British Empire had reached its peak, having colonies from Africa to India to everywhere in the world, pretty much. And so, having their huge military being beat by what they called spear-wielding savages was a huge hit for them. And so, once the Battle of Rourke's Drift came around, and this victory came to be, that kind of reversed some of that negative morale, and it kind of reaffirmed their thought that the British Empire was actually a capable fighting force.
So circling back to that comment you made earlier about the whole spear-wielding savages, were the Zulus funded by some external power being given weapons, or was it just that they were technologically inferior in a way to the British?
Yeah, so although most of their troops were equipped with throwing spears and cowhide shields, some of their warriors actually had more modern weapons. So they had muskets and a few more modern rifles. However, in their case, that actually didn't really play out as well as it could have. They were really missing ammunition and weren't really trained in marksmanship. So although they had a few thousand of these guns, they didn't have the resources or the training to use them.
All right, thank you very much for that. And so, stemming back to this war as a whole, how did the British actually become engaged in this war? Obviously, they were trying to grow and expand their empire, but was there any specific value they saw in this land? Rosa, I believe you're more well-versed in this topic.
Yeah. So in order to completely understand how the British ended up in a battle in South Africa, we have to go back to the 18th century when the European explorers were trying to find another way to get to India after they realized that the Americas were in fact a separate continent altogether. And the way that they did this was the southernmost tip of Africa. And ultimately the colony of Cape Town was established there. And it was just a supply point for ships that were sailing to Asia, so the settlers there didn't really have any interest in the interior of the country at all. And the Cape Colony was first a Dutch colony, but by the late 18th century, the British had taken control of it.
So now we can have a British, a view of why they're there. For the Zulus, were they just native to the land, or was there any other reason as to why they were in this area at the time of war?
So a little bit further up the coast of the southern tip of Africa, there were a bunch of different independent tribes. And in the 1780s, Shaka Zulu united all of these different independent tribes into one Zulu kingdom. And he developed new fighting techniques and convinced local chieftains of a reason to have one strong Zulu kingdom. And eventually, the tales of what he was doing made their way down the coast to the Europeans in Cape Town.
So did the Europeans see this growing power as something to kind of shy away from, avoid conflict and all that? Or did they just continue making their way towards that, knowing that a battle might occur in the future?
So initially, after the British took control of Cape Town, the only people who were moving further into the interior of the country were the Dutch farmers who had previously inhabited the Cape Colony, and they were known as the Boers. They moved inland to find new land to farm and to get out from under the control of the British. They eventually ended up establishing a colony that directly bordered Zululand. And this new colony, named Natal, was established in the 1830s, but it also ended up being annexed by the British.
So, as this continued with the annexing, were the Zulu continuing strong, under one ruler, or I believe you said chief earlier? So, Shaka Zulu ended up being assassinated by one of his relatives, and after that, the Zulu faced a lot of different infighting, and the losing sides from that infighting often fled to Natal, and at the same time, the Dutch Boers still wanted their own settlement away from the British, and so they established a third colony that bordered Zululand to the west, and this colony was called the Transvaal. And Europeans from both the Transvaal and Natal were pushing further and further into Zulu territory, and the Zulu were having a bunch of border disputes with the Dutch Boers in the Transvaal. So with this absence of power in the Zulu kingdom, did anyone rise to fulfill that? And as with any new leader, I'm assuming if one did, they really wanted to make a mark. And did they do anything to try to solve this growing tension over the border dispute?
So in 1873, Cetshwayo became the leader of the Zulu, and he was trying to reduce the tension with European neighbors, and so for his coronation, he ended up inviting a bunch of British leaders, and this kind of led the way for the British to start feeling like they had the right to meddle in Zulu politics. And this was just exacerbated when they discovered that there was gold to the interior of southern Africa, and they developed this whole new plan to create a confederation in southern Africa. And the first steps towards this goal was the annexation of the Transvaal in 1873. And that meant the border dispute between the Zulu and the Dutch Boers now became a British issue to deal with.
So was this issue what ultimately caused the war, or is there still more building blocks to the point of tipping over the scales and eventually fighting this war?
In 1878, there were two main things that kind of finally brought all of the tensions to a head and ultimately led to the war between the British and the Zulu. The first one occurred in July when two wives of a Zulu chieftain ran away to Natal to be with their European lovers. That chieftain had no plans of doing anything to interfere, but one of his sons felt the need to rectify the situation, and he gathered a large group of Zulu warriors to recapture the women and returned with them to Zululand. They ended up executing these women according to Zulu tradition, but they did this in front of a British outpost in Natal. And on top of this, the Zulu were also conducting cattle raids in Natal, which was just serving to further incense the British.
So, over the course of this, was there any, fighting caused over this border dispute? Maybe not full-on war, or was war declared yet at this point?
So, war was not declared yet, but on December 11th of 1878, the British finally made a decision about the border dispute, and they ended up siding with the Zulu, but they didn't side with the Zulu for free. They included conditions that one of them was to turn over the Zulu warriors who were involved in the execution of the wives of the chieftain. And the British said that if the Zulu didn't agree to these conditions, then they would declare war. And Cetshwayo was not about to acquiesce to the British requests, and so he made it very clear to his army that they were not going to be the aggressors in this war. They were not going to engage the British first, but they were not going to agree to the British terms.
So I'm going to assume with not agreeing to the British terms, the British then, that was finally the tipping point where it was time for war. You mentioned, obviously, that the Zulu kind of predicted this, and they were preparing in the sense that they weren't going to be the ones to attack first. Was there a first battle where the British did decide to attack the Zulu finally?
So the British were at a disadvantage going into this war, and they knew that. And the Zulu knew this too, because the Zulu had the resources and they knew the land better. The British commander, who ended up issuing a declaration of war on January 11th in 1879, wanted to force the Zulu to fight. He didn't want to get stuck, cut off from supplies. And so just 11 days after this declaration of war, the British Army made their first big drive into Zululand, and they did this in 3 different contingents. And one of those was involved at the Battle of Isandlwana, and they were heavily defeated, as Andrew mentioned earlier. However, one contingent of Cetshwayo's army, the Zulu army, had missed that battle and still wanted to be a part of the victory against the British, and that's when they turned their focus to the small British outpost just over the border in Natal, where many of the survivors of Isandlwana had retreated to, and that outpost was Rorke's Drift.
So now that we have looped back to Rorke's Drift, it affected British morale, as mentioned earlier by you, Andrew. So was there a specific reason as to why or how this news reached Britain so quick?
Yeah, so this battle and the war as a whole happened towards the end of the 1800s. And during that period of time, there was a lot of technological advancements, one of them being the telegraph. So unlike prior wars like the wars in the beginning of the 1800s and late 1700s, they had the telegraph, which allowed them to almost instantaneously transmit information from one to another. So also, like, unlike those wars when it takes usually either several weeks or even several months to get information back home, having this instant transmission between South Africa to the United Kingdom made it feel much closer to the British public. Their newspapers would often get information soon after the battle happened, and so even though the battle was thousands of miles away, British people felt much more connected to it and therefore held a much higher level of interest in it.
So that was the morale back in Britain. How's the morale of the soldiers at this time?
Yeah, so one of the most well-documented parts about this is that the soldiers had written letters home and also had written stuff in their diaries. And so we could kind of see how they felt. One of the letters that I ended up finding was from a soldier who's writing about the natives that are living there. And he actually went to say, "These Africans are a very barbarous lot. If they catch a man wounded, they cut him open and take out his heart and eat it. Africa is a very heathen place, much more so than England." And so you can kind of see that a lot of these soldiers didn't really see their opponents like even really as they're humans. They call them heathens, call them barbarians. So when battles like Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift happen, where there's huge casualties on both sides, they kind of are really surprised by this and really don't expect it because their expectations were so low, and having their pride, their military being defeated by what they perceived to be a much inferior force was a really big shock to them.
So with those differences, with the morale, how was this news spread in Britain at the time? And also, as history advanced, was it lost to history, or is this still a well-known and discussed topic into modern day?
Yeah, so once the news reached the UK, there wasn't really one uniform way that the newspapers approached it. Much like in every issue, there's always different ways of covering it in the right-leaning and left-leaning media. For example, in the left-leaning media, like newspapers like the Daily Mail, on one hand, they criticized the government's approach towards the war and how the ultimatum mentioned earlier kind of sucked the empire into what they saw as a kind of unnecessary war. They also did not go as to criticize the soldiers. They actually supported the soldiers and would not hesitate to emphasize the bravery and the courage of the British soldiers fighting the war. And on the right side, papers like the Times argued both that the subjugation of the Zulu power and also was a worthy adventure, and also that that the soldiers were to be supported. And actually, the Times said that the subjugation of the Zulu power and the destruction of the military organization must be accomplished at any cost and with the most efficient means at our command, which kind of pushes what was previously a relatively minor colonial war into a national issue that everyone was soon to be able to talk about.
So unfortunately, we are out of time for today's episode. I'd like to thank Rosa and Andrew both for coming in today to speak to us. And everyone back listening at home, make sure to come back next week when we bring on Billy, who's going to talk more about World War I aircraft. Don't forget to like and subscribe. This is Trey Marcantonio, and have a great weekend.